8. Mysterious money.
神秘的货币，
The ebb and flow of the yen.
日元的涨落，
Hot money.
热钱。
We have arrived in the 1980s, an era of financial deregulation in the industrialized countries, and one of globalization of the capital markets. The supervision of banking and securities industries was loosened, cartels in the financial sector were uprooted, and firms were exposed to heightened competition. Most industrialized countries lifted their restrictions on the movement of capital. As the international mobility of money increased, huge sums could be transferred between countries and between different kinds of assets in a split second.
我们已经来到了1980年代，这是工业化国家金融接管的时代，也是资本市场全球化的时代。银行和证券行业的监管被放松，金融领域的卡特尔被根除，企业面临着加剧的竞争。大多数工业化国家取消了对资本流动的限制。随着资金的国际流动性增加，巨额资金可以在一瞬间在国家之间以及不同类型的资产之间转移。
Although the 1980s were also an era of booming international trade, the flow of goods and services was outclassed by the volume of rapidly expanding capital flows. During that decade, the quantity of financial cross-border transactions reached a multiple of more than 20 times trade flows. 0.14 and exchange transactions reached $500 billion in a day.
尽管1980年代也是国际贸易繁荣的时代，但商品和服务的流动被迅速扩大的资本流动量所超越。在那个10年里，金融跨境交易的数量达到了贸易流动量的20多倍，外汇交易在一天内达到了半万亿美元。
The increased use of offshore financial centers free from regulation further amplified the volume of hot money that was chasing highest returns around the globe. Large-scale institutional investors grew in importance. Hedge funds, designed to make profits from market crashes, grew exponentially in size and began to dominate foreign exchange markets. Dealers, in front of keyboards and green monitors, had at their fingertips the execution of big-ticket international investment transactions that could affect countries in far-flung corners of the world. A switch in the beliefs of fund managers could send a torrent of money from one country to another, moving exchange rates and bond and stock markets worldwide. Or so it was said.
对离岸金融中心的增加使用，这些中心免于监管，进一步放大了在全球范围内追求最高回报的热钱量。大规模的机构投资者的重要性日益增长。对冲基金旨在从市场崩溃中获利，规模呈指数级增长，并开始主导外汇市场。交易员在键盘和绿色监视器前可以执行影响世界各地的大额国际投资交易。基金经理的信念转变可能会使大量资金从一个国家流向另一个国家，影响全球的汇率和债券及股票市场。或者至少人们是这么说的。
Japanese money flooded the world.
日本的资金充斥全球。
Though it may have appeared as if most industrialized countries increased their capital exports, in reality the money originated from only a few places. Since the 1970s, the top capital exporters, namely the United States, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, United Kingdom, Canada, Holland, Denmark, Switzerland, and Saudi Arabia, had accounted for about 85% of all reported long-term international capital flows. But in 1987, 86.6% of the net capital exports of these countries were due to Japan alone. 2.
尽管看起来大多数工业化国家都增加了他们的资本出口，但实际上这些资金只来自于少数几个地方。自1970年代以来，最大的资本出口国即美国、日本、德国、法国、意大利、英国、加拿大、荷兰、丹麦、瑞士和沙特阿拉伯占据了所有报告的长期国际资本流动的大约 85%。但在1987年，这些国家的净资本出口的 86.6% 都是由日本单独贡献的。
From the mid-1980s until the end of the decade, Japanese foreign investment all but dominated international capital flows. Only 40 years after defeat in the Pacific War, Japan seemed to hold the key to international money flows. The global phenomenon of international capital flows was first and foremost a Japanese phenomenon.
从1980年代中期到10年末，日本的外国投资几乎主导了国际资本流动。在太平洋战争失败40年后，日本似乎掌握了国际资金流动的关键。 国际资本流动的全球现象首先是一个日本现象。
Japanese long-term capital flows multiplied from a net inflow of more than $2 billion in 1980 to an outflow of nearly $10 billion in 1981. However, they literally exploded over the next 4 years, multiplying by a factor of almost 7 to reach a historic $65 billion in 1985. Then, over the next year alone, they doubled again, blowing up to a massive $132 billion. In 1987, another record was set when a tide of $137 billion swept over the exchanges, followed by outflows of $131 billion the following year. In 1987, the net long-term capital outflows were almost twice as large as the already record-breaking current account surplus. This financial tsunami easily overtook even the OPEC surpluses of the 1970s.3.
日本的长期资本流动从1980年的净流入超过20亿美元，增加到1981年的净流出近100亿美元。然而，在接下来的4年里，他们几乎爆炸式的增长了近7倍，到1985年达到了历史性的650亿美元。然后，在接下来的1年里，他们又翻了一番，飙升到了惊人的1320亿美元。1987年又创下了一个纪录。当1370亿美元的资金潮涌入交易所，紧接着在次年流出了1310亿美元。1987年的净长期资本流出几乎是已经创纪录的经常账户盈余的2倍。这场金融海啸轻易地超过了1970年代的石油输出国盈余。
The money began to reshape the world in Japan's image. Outbidding or swallowing rivals, Japanese money bought financial and real assets all over the world. Japanese factories opened in greenfield sites in Scotland, Wales, and northern England. Japanese cars were manufactured in the Midwest of the United States. Icons of U.S. business prowess, such as the Rockefeller Center, Columbia Pictures, and even Pebble Beach Golf Course, fell into Japanese hands. Japanese restaurants and hotels sprang up in the world's major cities to cater to Japan's corporate raiders. Hawaiian real estate came to be dominated by Japanese investors. The same happened in parts of California and the most attractive parts of Australia. Asia was stuffed with Japanese factories, turning into Japan's new sweatshop. It seemed that slowly but surely, perhaps not even that slowly, the world was coming to be owned by the Japanese.
日本的资金开始以日本的形象重塑世界。通过出价竞购或吞并竞争对手，日本的资金在全球购买了金融和实体资产。日本的工厂在苏格兰、威尔士和英格兰北部的绿地上开设。日本汽车在美国中西部生产。美国商业实力的象征，如洛克菲勒中心、哥伦比亚影片公司，甚至是卵石滩高尔夫球场，都落入了日本人的手中。日本的餐馆和酒店在世界主要城市涌现，以迎合日本的企业掠夺者。夏威夷的房地产市场被日本投资者主导。加利福尼亚的部分地区和澳大利亚最具吸引力的地区也是如此。亚洲充满了日本的工厂，变成了日本的新工厂。似乎慢慢的，甚至可能并不那么慢，世界正在被日本人所拥有。
This created fear and drew resentment. Labor unions in the United States started to mobilize their members against the Japanese threat. Economists developed strategies for the United States to avoid being completely owned by Japan. Some voices warned that Japan had lost the war but was now winning the peace by economic means. 4 management gurus urged business leaders all over the world to adopt Japanese-style techniques as the last resort to withstand le défi japonais.
这引发了恐惧，引来了怨恨。美国的工会开始动员他们的成员对抗日本的威胁。经济学家为美国制定了策略，以避免被日本完全拥有。有些声音警告说，日本虽然输掉了战争，但现在正在通过经济手段赢得和平。管理大师们敦促全球的商业领袖们采用日本式的技术，作为抵抗日本挑战的最后手段。
Direct investment dwarfed by portfolio investment.
直接投资被投资组合投资所 dwarf。
Most analyses of Japanese money flows divide them into portfolio investment, which is financial investment, for instance, in government bonds, and foreign direct investment, FDI, which comprises purchases of real assets by foreigners, such as real estate and companies. 5 Japanese net foreign direct investment, FDI, rose from $2 billion in 1980 to $6 billion in 1985. Outflows then accelerated further. By the following year, overseas direct investment had more than doubled to $14 billion and more than doubled again by 1988, reaching $34 billion. In 1989 and 1990, Japan's outflow of direct investment, at $45 billion and $46 billion respectively, was the largest in the world. By 1988, more than half of all FDI was directed at the United States and Europe. 6.
大多数关于日本资金流动的分析都将其分为投资组合投资及金融投资，例如政府债券，以及外国直接投资 FDI， 包括外国人购买的实体资产，如房地产和公司。日本的境外国直接投资 FDI 从1980年的20亿美元增加到1985年的60亿美元，然后资金流出进一步加速，到第二年，海外直接投资已经增加了1倍多，达到140亿美元，并在1988年再次增加了1倍多，达到340亿美元。在1989年和1990年，日本的直接投资流出分别为450亿美元和460亿美元，是全球最大的。到1988年，超过一半的所有 FDI 都投向了美国和欧洲。
The Japanese foreign direct investment reached historic proportions. Until the late 1980s, they made up only a small part of the long-term outflows, the greatest part being due to portfolio investments. Net portfolio outflows rose from $1.9 billion in 1983 to $23.6 billion in 1984, multiplying by a factor of 12. And then more than quadrupled again in the following 2 years to peak at $101.40 billion. 7.
尽管日本的外国直接投资达到了历史性的比例，但直到1980年代末，它们只占长期资金流出的一小部分，最大的部分是由于投资组合投资。净投资组合流出从1983年的19亿美元增加到1984年的236亿美元，增长了12倍，然后在接下来的2年中又增加了4倍多，达到了1014亿美元。
These remarkable developments could not fail to leave a strong impact on international securities markets. In the 1980s, international bond markets had become unthinkable without the ubiquitous Japanese presence. At their peak in 1986, 77% of total net portfolio outflows were directed into bonds, the rest into foreign stocks and shares. Almost 90% of investment in foreign securities was in U.S. Treasury bonds. 8. Japanese money mopped up a staggering 75% of all Treasury bonds auctioned off in 1986. 9. Portfolio flows peaked in 1986, while foreign direct investment rose steadily in importance. In 1990, at $48 billion, foreign direct investment had taken the lead over portfolio investment, and Japan became the world's #1 provider of direct investment. 10.
这些显著的发展无疑对国际证券市场产生了强烈的影响。在1980年代，没有日本的存在，国际债券市场是无法想象的。在1986年的高峰期，77%的总净投资组合流出都投向了债券，其余的投向了外国股票和股份。几乎90%的外国证券投资都在美国国债上。日本的资金在1986年购买了惊人的75%的所有拍卖的国债。投资组合流动在1986年达到高峰，而外国直接投资的重要性则稳步提高。到1990年，外国直接投资达到480亿美元，超过了投资组合投资，日本成为了全球最大的直接投资提供者。
Actual Japanese capital outflows were even larger.
实际的日本资本外流更大。
Despite the staggering sums, the actual extent of Japanese foreign acquisitions in the 1980s is still understated by the official figures. The true figures will probably never be known. The gap between data and reality did not open accidentally. Faced with criticism of both the trade surpluses and the large foreign acquisitions, the International Finance Bureau of the Ministry of Finance concocted a clever way of reducing both figures. The trick was to count capital outflows as imports of goods. Miraculously, both figures improve in one stroke. Such creative accounting was undertaken with items such as offshore gold accounts and aircraft leasing. 11.
尽管数额惊人，但官方数据仍低估了日本在1980年代的外国收购实际规模。真实的数字可能永远无法得知。 数据与现实之间的差距并非偶然产生。面对对贸易顺差和大规模外国收购的批评，财政部国际金融局想出了一种巧妙的方式来减少这两个数字。这个技巧就是将资本外流计算为商品进口。神奇的是，这两个数字一下子就改善了。这种创新的会计方式是通过海外黄金账户和飞机租赁等项目进行的。11.
In the mid-1980s, a gold rush seemed to have hit Japan. In the first half of the 1980s, Japan had already become the world's foremost importer of gold bullion. In 1984, 192 tons of gold were shipped to Japan. In 1986, this had risen to almost 600 tons, making up half of the entire world production of gold by non-communist countries. 12. This helped reduce the trade surpluses because it boosted imports. It is not surprising, then, that the one-off import of 300 tons of gold to mint coins in celebration of the 60th anniversary of the late Emperor Hirohito's reign was booked through New York. 13.
在1980年代中期，日本似乎爆发了一场淘金热。在1980年代的前半段，日本已经成为世界上最大的黄金进口国。1984年，有192吨黄金运到日本。到1986年，这个数字增加到了近600吨，占非共产主义国家全球黄金产量的一半。12，这有助于减少贸易顺差，因为它提高了进口。因此，为了庆祝已故的裕仁天皇在位60周年，通过纽约预定一次性进口300吨黄金铸币，并不令人惊讶。13.
Gold purchases were far larger than gold shipments. However, much of the gold bought by Japanese investors never reached Japan. Trading houses offered to store imported gold in London in order to reduce transportation costs. Japanese securities houses aggressively pushed so-called gold savings accounts, which nominally constituted gold investments and hence gold imports. However, the gold purchases were conducted on paper only and gold never physically moved from the foreign countries involved. But on a balance of payments basis, such investments were counted as imports to Japan. In 1990, this capital outflow reached about $6 billion. 14. The authorities' liberalization of gold transactions in 1982 had set off the process. MOF also gave the licenses for the gold accounts, and it ordered the memorial gold coins. 15. None of these capital outflows was listed in the capital account. Instead, they lowered the trade surplus by that much.
然而，黄金购买量远大于黄金运输量。日本投资者购买的大部分黄金从未到达日本。贸易公司提议在伦敦储存进口的黄金，以减少运输成本。日本证券公司积极推动所谓的黄金储蓄账户，这在名义上构成了黄金投资，因此是黄金进口。然而，黄金购买只是在纸面上进行，黄金从未从涉及的外国实际移动。但在支付平衡基础上，这样的投资被计算为对日本的进口。到1990年，这种资本外流达到了约60亿美元。1982年，当局对黄金交易的自由化引发了这个过程。财政部也颁发了黄金账户的许可证，并下令铸造纪念黄金硬币。15这些资本外流都没有列入资本账户，相反，它们降低了贸易顺差。
Some other ways to artificially reduce the trade surplus had been well tested in the past. In the late 1970s, when Japan's current account surplus had already produced trade friction with other countries, a scheme dubbed the Samurai Plan was devised by MITI and some of Japan's top banks, and was later supported by the Ministry of Finance. 16. This scheme would allow cosmetic changes of the current account surplus. When foreign parties wanted to buy big-ticket items, such as aircraft, from other foreign parties, Japanese banks would step in, buy the item, and lease it to the one who wanted it. The Ministry of Finance would provide the foreign exchange reserves to the government-owned Export-Import Bank, which would finance the deals. Both Japanese commercial banks and the lessor would make sizable profits from this taxpayer-financed transaction.
一些其他人为减少贸易顺差的方法，在过去已经得到了充分的测试。在1970年代末，当日本的经常账户顺差已经引发了与其他国家的贸易摩擦时，由经济产业省和一些日本顶级银行设计的一项名为武士计划的方案得到了财政部的支持。16这个方案将允许对经常账户顺差进行表面上的改变。 当外国方面想从其他外国方面购买大宗商品，如飞机时，日本银行会介入购买该商品，并将其租赁给需要的一方。财政部将外汇储备提供给政府所有的进出口银行，由其负责融资交易。日本商业银行和租赁方都将从这个由纳税人资助的交易中获得可观的利润。
Whenever an airline bought aircraft from a foreign manufacturer, Japan's government could potentially use it to reduce the recorded current account surplus, as the transaction would appear to be an import to Japan. It was crucial, though, to maintain the legal fiction that the lease was only temporary, since normally financing leases would not count as imports. In 1979, MITI thought that the scheme was a trump card in reducing the surpluses by an estimated $800 million in fiscal 1979 alone. 17 The Ministry of Finance, worried that the IMF might see through the scheme, called it off after a year. However, in the 1980s, with the trade surplus ballooning again, a more sophisticated version of the leasing scheme, involving overseas subsidiaries of Japanese firms and banks, was finally implemented. Japan became a major player in the international aircraft leasing market, with the biggest aircraft leasing firm fully owned by a Japanese company.
每当一家航空公司从外国制造商那里购买飞机时，日本政府都有可能利用它来减少记录在册的经常账户顺差，因为这笔交易看起来像是对日本的进口。然而，保持租赁只是暂时的这种法律虚构是至关重要的，因为通常融资租赁不会被计算为进口。1979年，经济产业省认为该方案是减少顺差的王牌，仅在1979财年就预计减少了约8亿美元。时期财政部担心国际货币基金组织可能会看穿这个方案，因此在1年后停止了它。然而，在1980年代，随着贸易顺差再次膨胀，涉及日本公司和银行的海外子公司的租赁方案的更复杂版本最终得以实施。日本成为国际飞机租赁市场的主要参与者，最大的飞机租赁公司完全由一家日本公司所有。
In addition to these misrepresentations of capital outflows, many capital exports took place that are not recorded at all, the size of the errors and omissions. Item in the Japanese balance of payments was often larger than the entire current account surplus. In 1989 in Japan, capital outflows amounting to 3 trillion yen were unaccounted for and listed in the balance of payments as errors and omissions. That was almost half the size of the officially registered net long-term capital outflow of 6.6 yen trillion. 18 At the time, the IMF warned that international statistics on international capital flows have become so patchy that it has become difficult to ascertain each country's true capital or current account position and, therefore, how much saving the country has been providing to, or absorbing from, the rest of the world. 19.
除了这些对资本流出的误报外，还有许多未被记录的资本出口。日本支付平衡表中的错误和遗漏项目的规模往往大于整个经常账户盈余。1989年，在日本，高达3万亿日元的资本流出未被记录，而在支付平衡表中被列为错误和遗漏。这几乎是官方登记的 6.6 万亿日元净长期资本流出的一半。18当时，国际货币基金组织警告说，国际资本流动的统计数据已经如此零散，以至于很难确定每个国家的真实资本或经常账户位置，因此很难确定该国家向世界其他地方提供或吸收了多少储蓄。19.
Many acquisitions by Japanese companies were not measured by the balance of payments at all. One way of evasion is to finance them via Japanese bank subsidiaries in London or New York. The bank sends the money from its Tokyo head office to foreign affiliates as an interoffice transfer, which is not recorded as long-term capital export in the balance of payment statistics. Better still would be to send the money abroad as an interoffice transfer and then re-import it as official capital inflow. As a result, the officially recorded long-term capital outflows will appear that much smaller. Precisely such a scheme was introduced in the 1980s, when Japanese banks offered so-called impact loans to domestic customers. Under this system, a Japanese borrower took out a dollar loan. That was immediately swapped into yen, rendering it a normal yen loan for the borrower. But the loans were booked through offshore centers and then counted as long-term capital imports in the balance of payment statistics. In other words, a domestic transaction, a yen loan, was booked in such a way that it would appear as a capital import in the statistics and would therefore reduce the total net capital export figures of the Japanese balance of payments. 20.
许多日本公司的收购根本没有被支付平衡表计量。一种逃避的方式是通过在伦敦或纽约的日本银行子公司进行融资。银行从其东京总部将资金作为内部转账发送到海外分支机构，这并未被记录为支付平衡统计中的长期资本出口。更好的方法是将资金作为内部转账发送到海外，然后将其作为官方资本流入重新进口。结果，官方记录的长期资本流出将显得更小。正是在20世纪80年代，日本银行向国内客户提供了所谓的影响贷款。在这个系统下，日本借款人取出了一笔美元贷款，这笔贷款立即被换成日元，对借款人来说，它就变成了一笔普通的日元贷款。但是，这些贷款是通过离岸中心进行记账的，然后在支付平衡统计中记为长期资本进口。换句话说，一笔国内交易日元贷款被记账为资本进口，从而减少了日本支付平衡表的总净资本出口数字。2是
The mystery of Japanese money.
日本货币的神秘之处。
Although the precise figures may never be known, the officially published figures of Japanese foreign investment were already large enough to worry many observers, not least because they seemed to defy economic logic. In the 1970s, Japanese capital flows followed the textbooks. They were roughly equal in size to Japan's trade or current account surplus. Thus, money earned from Japanese net exports was merely recycled back abroad as foreign investment. Trade movements appeared to be the driving force, to which capital flows adjusted.
尽管精确的数字可能永远无法得知，但日本公布的外国投资数字已经足够大，足以让许多观察者感到担忧，尤其是因为它们似乎违背了经济逻辑。在1970年代，日本的资本流动遵循教科书，它们大致等于日本的贸易或经常账户盈余。因此，日本进出口赚取的钱只是被回收作为外国投资。贸易运动似乎是驱动力，资本流动则进行调整。
In the 1980s, this textbook scenario had disappeared. Now the momentum did not originate in the current account. Long-term capital outflows preceded the current account surplus in timing and by far exceeded it in size. Japan was purchasing far more assets abroad than it could afford due to its exports. To fund its international shopping spree in the 1980s, Japan actually had to borrow foreign currency. 21.
到了1980年代，这种教科书情景已经消失。现在的动力并不源于经常账户，长期资本流出在时间上限于经常账户盈余，并且在规模上远远超过它。日本购买的海外资产远超过其出口所能负担的。为了在1980年代资助其国际购物狂欢，日本实际上不得不借用外币。21.
Economists had a hard time explaining this phenomenon. Some thought that the abolition of capital controls must have been responsible. Indeed, legal regulations were eased gradually over the 1980s, with benchmark changes of the foreign exchange law in 1980. However, most large institutional investors stayed well below their legal foreign investment limits in the second half of the 1980s. 22. Moreover, the question remained why investors suddenly chose to invest so much abroad. Another frequently cited explanation was that Japan's capital exports were due to Japan's high national savings. But this ex post facto accounting identity does not tell us anything about why Japan's savings were so large.
经济学家很难解释这种现象。有些人认为，资本管制的废除必须负责。的确，法律规定在1980年代逐渐放宽，其中包括1980年的外汇法的基准变化。然而，在1980年代的下半叶，大多数大型机构投资者的外国投资额远低于他们的法定限额。22. 此外，问题仍然是为什么投资者突然选择投资如此多的海外资产？另一个经常被引用的解释是，日本的资本出口是由于日本的高国民储蓄。但是，这种事后的会计等式并不能告诉我们为什么日本的储蓄如此大。
In their empirical work, most researchers disaggregated long-term capital flow figures into portfolio investment and foreign direct investment, and then tried to build models that could explain them separately. The main model explaining portfolio investments was based on standard portfolio diversification. Investors are assumed to reduce risk by holding a diversified portfolio. The model can be tested by checking whether the information available on asset returns in Japan as compared to the rest of the world is sufficient to explain the actual investment pattern. In practice, this boiled down to checking whether the differential between Japanese and foreign interest rates could explain Japanese capital flows.
在他们的实证研究中，大多数研究人员将长期资本流动数据细分为投资组合投资和外国直接投资，然后试图构建能够分别解释它们的模型。解释投资组合投资的主要模型基于标准的投资组合多元化，假设投资者通过持有多元化的投资组合来降低风险。该模型可以通过检查关于资产回报与世界其他地方相比，在日本的可用信息是否足以解释实际的投资模式来进行测试。在实践中，这归结为检查日本和外国利率之间的差异是否能解释日本的资本流动。
Unfortunately, these models failed to explain Japanese portfolio investment. Point 23 When the interest differential did not move much, Japanese foreign investment increased. Even when the relative returns moved against foreign investment, Japanese money continued to flow out. That was particularly puzzling when the yen rose significantly in the mid-1980s, for it meant that Japanese investors lost money over a protracted time period. As foreign investments lost their value in terms of the yen. Point 24 In the 2 years between January 1985 and January 1987, approximately 40% of the cumulative value of Japanese overseas investment had been wiped out in yen terms. Despite this, Japanese investors continued to invest in sizable amounts in U.S. and other foreign assets. This anomaly persisted over several years despite the fact that the intention of the Plaza Agreement, namely, to strengthen the yen, was not in doubt.
不幸的是，这些模型无法解释日本的投资组合投资。23当利率差异不大时，日本的外国投资增加了。即使相对回报对外国投资不利，日本的资金仍然继续流出。这在1980年代中期日元大幅上涨时尤其令人困惑，因为这意味着日本投资者在一个漫长的时间段内亏损，因为外国投资在日元的价值上失去了价值。24在1985年1月和1987年1月的2年间，日本海外投资的累计价值大约有 40% 在日元计价的情况下被抹去。尽管如此，日本投资者仍然继续在美国和其他外国资产中投资大量的资金。尽管广场协议的意图及加强日元毫无疑问，但这种异常现象在几年内一直持续。
It had to be admitted that serious studies of Japanese foreign investment have not been particularly successful in explaining the rapid growth of capital outflows, and many a report ended with the words that Japanese foreign investment was hard to understand, counterintuitive, or something of a mystery. 25 The dramatic surge of Japanese foreign investment remained an enigma for the experts.
不得不承认，对日本外国投资的严肃研究并未特别成功地解释资本流出的快速增长。许多报告以日本外国投资难以理解、违反直觉或有些神秘等词语结束。25日本外国投资的急剧增长对专家们来说仍然是一个谜。
Reversal of the tide.
潮流的逆转。
Economic models of Japanese foreign investment focused on the period of rapidly rising foreign investment. They failed to explain them, and were even more helpless in explaining the events of the 1990s. In 1991, as the Japanese current account was heading for new record surpluses, topping $90 billion, net long-term capital outflows had suddenly vanished. Japan recorded $40 billion worth of net inflows of long-term capital, the first in more than a decade. Japanese investors became net sellers of foreign securities in record figures. 26 Japan remained a net seller of foreign assets throughout 1991. From manufacturers to banks and real estate firms, Japanese money was suddenly retreating on all fronts. 27
日本外国投资的经济模型关注的是外国投资快速增长的时期，他们无法解释这些，甚至更无法解释1990年代的事件。1991年，当日本经常账户即将创下新的纪录盈余超过900亿美元时，净长期资本流出突然消失。日本记录了400亿美元的净长期资本流入，这是10多年来的首次。 日本投资者成为创纪录的外国证券的净买家。26日本在1991年全年都是外国资产的净买家。从制造商到银行和房地产公司，日本的资金突然在所有方面都在撤退。27
With increasing losses on their foreign investments, it had become apparent even to the last believers in the profit motive that Japanese corporations, and in particular the country's financial institutions, had not invested for profits. There were hardly any profits. As it turned out, even giants had not bothered to conduct cash flow analyses and profit projections about their numerous foreign acquisitions. 28.
随着他们在外国投资上的损失增加，即使是最后的利润动机的信仰者也明白了，日本的公司，特别是该国的金融机构，并没有为了利润而投资，几乎没有任何利润。事实证明，即使是巨头，也没有对他们的众多外国收购进行现金流分析和利润预测。28
Researchers struggled to explain the puzzling aberration of a record current account surplus accompanied by a sizable long-term capital account surplus. Standard analyses failed to provide an explanation of the extraordinary movements of Japanese foreign investment in the 1980s and the early 1990s. This gap in the economic understanding of the world could be excused if it concerned the capital account behavior of, for instance, the Principality of Liechtenstein. But the lack of understanding of the determinants of capital movements of the biggest capital exporter in history, whose money has directly affected companies, governments, and lives in many countries all over the world over a period of more than a decade, should not be excused easily. It is well worth researching what was behind these dramatic events. 29.
研究人员难以解释这样一个令人困惑的异常现象：创纪录的经常账户盈余伴随着相当大的长期资本账户盈余。标准分析未能解释日本在1980年代和1990年代初的外国投资的非凡动态。如果这种经济理解的缺口涉及到例如列支敦士登公国的资本账户行为，那么或许可以被原谅。但是，对于历史上最大的资本出口国的资本流动决定因素的理解不足，这个国家的资金直接影响了全球许多国家的公司、政府和生活，且这种影响持续了10多年。这种理解不足不应轻易被原谅。研究这些戏剧性事件背后的原因是非常值得的。